Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The 100-Year Walk, an Armenian Odyssey, by Anahid Mackeen, narrated by Emily Wu Zeller and Neil Shah. Part 1. Before. The Lost World, 2006. For as long as I can remember, my mother has been talking to her dead parents. Growing up, I would find her in the kitchen, locked in conversation with Mama and Baba. At the sink, her hands scrubbing a dish, her voice a murmur. So it was no surprise when, in the summer of 2006, I stumbled on her again like this. It had been just a few weeks since I had moved back into my childhood home, and there I was in the doorway trying to eavesdrop, just like I had back in grade school. Only now I was 35. I couldn't quite make out her words, drowned as they were by running water and the clank of Corel plates. Oblivious to me standing there, my mother continued to shake her cropped brown bob back and forth, moving her lips furtively. "Inchke medadzis," she said, shaking her head, the Armenian word sounding like gibberish to me. "Are you talking to them again?" I asked. "Yes," she replied, her mood perennially upbeat. "I ask them for advice, and they always give it to me. They are my spirit guides, Don." "They should be yours, too." I rolled my eyes and we both laughed, not taking ourselves too seriously. In the weeks since I'd left my bustling life in New York and returned to the Los Angeles house where I had been raised, my mother's otherworldly talks had become part of my universe again. I'd forgotten the never-ending surprises of life with my small but plucky mother, Anahid. Spontaneous and excitable, she could transform a drab doctor's office or a corner diner into a party, just by raising her arms and breaking into dance. My father, Jim, and I would remark that she was the last person you'd expect to be a probation officer. She was unflinchingly positive about the human capacity for goodness, allowing the petty criminals she supervised to get away with nearly anything on her watch. She devoted her life to helping people, not only her clients, but also Armenian immigrants unfamiliar with the customs of the United States. Our phone was constantly ringing. She'd taught my American father and me just enough of the language for us to say, "One moment," in Armenian, "Meg farirkien," when people called and started prattling away about needing a ride to the doctor, the lawyer, or the green card office. Despite the comfort of being back in my roomy Spanish-style home, the initial excitement had worn off. Huddled under my flower-print bedspread, surrounded by high school soccer trophies and my homecoming princess tiara, I felt like a character in a dark comedy about an aging prom queen who returns to her childhood home after flaming out in the big city. By the hour, my life in New York felt farther away. My morning runs through snowy Central Park before work. My deadline hustle to file yet another healthcare story at my magazine job. My race to meet friends after work for a wine-fueled late dinner somewhere dark and candlelit. For years, my life in New York had felt like a sprint in a marathon that I never wanted to stop. It was what I craved. It was what I thought I needed. It was why I'd left my home and moved across the country in the first place. But shortly after my birthday the previous February, something had changed. I'd never paid much attention to my mother's calls to come home, but suddenly I couldn't ignore her anymore. Perhaps it was her advanced age. She was then 78. Or maybe it was my own realization that, as a reporter, I was spending my life telling other people's stories and ignoring my own family's incredible one. Because my grandfather had died when I was a toddler, what I knew about him was mostly family legend. Countless times I had heard the dramatic tales from my mother of how her father, Stepan Miskjian, had wandered in the desert of what is now Syria, how he had staggered across it for a week on nothing but 2 cups of water, how he had led a group of Armenians to safety, away from the Turks who wanted to kill them. She'd repeated this tale on loop. As she saw it, any occasion, during a morning bowl of Cheerios or after a piece of birthday cake, was the right time to recount her father's near-death experience. His story had truly haunted her childhood, too, when days would begin and end with Baba in tears as he retold what he'd witnessed. He made a new home for his family in Spanish Harlem, but they were so poor she slept in a hammock. Perhaps looking into his daughter's innocent face reminded him of the thousands of children in their orphan uniforms who had paraded past him in the camps on their way to be slaughtered. He had lost almost everything in the ethnic cleansing. All he had was his story. This was our family's heirloom, our most precious bequest, and it was inherited by every subsequent generation, along with the burden of telling it again. Still, as a kid, I retained nothing from the much-repeated saga but the single detail that he'd drunk his own urine to survive in the desert. Repulsed, I'd always ask, why would anyone do that? It's because he was Armenian and faced very difficult times, my mother would explain. It's all here. And then she'd pull out 2 small booklets published by an Armenian press in the 1960s, her dad's first-hand account of his survival, focused on the period when he was fleeing the Turks in Mesopotamia. I would stare at the hundreds of pages of Indo-European script, unable to cross the language barrier and uncover the secrets of his memoir, a narrative he'd begun writing in the 1930s and continued working on for the rest of his life. My mother had spent many years attempting to translate these booklets into English. This wasn't just her personal desire to share our family's trials, but part of an attempt to educate the world and ensure that ethnic cleansing never happened again. Her father's story was the story of the forgotten genocide. The trains stuffed with people, the death marches, the internment camps. All were familiar horrors to me, to my generation, but the images I'd seen were from the Holocaust of World War II. As the Jews would be, the Armenian minority had been demonized as a threat to society. The Ottoman Empire used the global tumult of World War I as a cover. The majority of the 2 million Ottoman Armenians had been forced from their homes and deported to barren regions they had seen only on maps, if at all. From 1915 to 1918, an estimated 1,200,000 Armenians perished. Those who managed to stay alive were scattered across the globe. My mother's surviving aunts and uncles lived in Turkey, France, and the United States, something I had previously thought was a little glamorous. After learning more about my family history, I found it heartbreaking. Entire families had been lost or severed from one another. Stateless, some of them drifting like embers after a fire, the rest just ashes. Adolf Hitler, before his invasion of Poland in September 1939, said, "Kill without pity or mercy. Who still talks nowadays of the extermination of the Armenians?" In a way, der Fuhrer was right. Only the Armenians seemed to remember the Armenians. "Help me, Dawn. Help me tell Baba's story," my mother would often say as the years went by, and I embarked on a career as a reporter. "Please help me," she repeated on the phone when I was living in Chicago, San Francisco, D.C., New York. "Almost done, Dawn. We're going to print this," she informed me when I came home every Christmas. In truth, despite her determination, her translation would never be finished. Her father's language was too difficult. She could speak Armenian fluently, but she could barely read the characters. She had learned the language from her mother, but had never formally studied it. However, that didn't stop her from trying. She grew ever more resolute as Turkey's denials of genocide grew in volume, with its claims that the Armenians had staged an uprising and sided with the Russian enemy during a time of war, and that their deaths were an unfortunate consequence of that. She watched as her parents and her parents' friends and nearly all the other eyewitnesses died. To my mother and many Armenians, genocide is an important word. Massacres, atrocities, killings, all these words fail to describe the murder of a nation, as Henry Morgenthau, the American ambassador to Constantinople, called it at the time. Nearly 20 countries, including France and Canada, officially used the term, which was created during World War II by a Polish Jew, Raphael Lemkin, to describe the atrocities against the Armenians and the Jews. I didn't understand my mother's commitment, her sense of urgency, until April 2004, when a distant relative finally intervened and translated my grandfather's 2 booklets. I'll never forget the cross-country flight when I read what my grandfather Stepan remembered, in his own words. His stories transported me back to a very different era, to the last days of the Ottoman Empire, when the Great War consumed much of the world. Being a witness to that satanic pogrom, I vowed it as my duty to put to paper what I saw. My grandfather wrote in the introduction to his memoirs, in a straightforward, unemotional style that I would come to know well. With his extraordinary memory, he described his road to hell, relating his conversations with the guards overseeing the death march and his dying friend's last utterances. As I turned the pages, I felt sickened by what he had endured. I slowly came to understand what it meant. My mother existed. I existed. My aunt, my uncle, my cousins' children. My entire family existed because he had survived what so many had not. Nearly a century later, where was my sense of moral obligation? Doing nothing felt like forgetting, and forgetting genocide seemed almost as heinous as the crime itself, especially in light of Turkey's denials. I read these booklets, which represented only a portion of his remarkable life, and although I did not move back to Los Angeles for another 2 years, the seeds were sown. Now I wanted to help my mother tell Baba's whole story. I needed to better understand the past. I finally moved across the country in May of 2006, and soon enough, that summer seemingly evaporated in a haze of Los Angeles heat, punctuated by my mother's supernatural talks at the kitchen sink. By August, I was deep into my routine of squandering days at a cafe sipping double non-fat lattes and reading about the genocide. My plan upon arriving home had been to fill in the gaps in my grandfather's stories and begin shaping them into a proper account. But the plan was quickly stymied by a near-total lack of information. Most of the witnesses and survivors were dead. Their children, too. The bulk of the primary accounts were written in a language I didn't understand. And though Baba's memoir was powerful, it recorded just a few years of his life and ignored other critical periods of the ethnic cleansing. There were so many missing pieces in his story, gaps that left us wondering what had transpired before he landed in an internment camp in the middle of the war. Eager to help, my mother had been calling all her friends, trying to locate survivors from her parents' hometown for me to interview. It was an almost hopeless task, and the only lead she had was one old lady she remembered who had known my grandfather and could possibly tell us more about the deportations from their hometown. One afternoon, following my daily coffee binge, I returned home depressed by the reading material and frustrated by my lack of progress. In the living room, near the stained glass windows, my father, a retired auditor, was leaning back in his leather lazy-boy, feet up, Consumer Reports in hand. From where I stood, only the crown of his head was visible. Across the room, my mother sat on the lime-green sofa turning the pages of the Los Angeles Times. The green shag carpet I remembered from my childhood had long ago been ripped out, but almost everything else seemed frozen in time. My mother could never throw anything away. Even the smallest items had value. She rarely bought new clothes or furniture. An austerity measure that I was beginning to understand was a symptom of her having had nothing as a child in Istanbul and making do with hand-me-downs. That afternoon, I walked off to my room without saying a word to the good people who'd raised me. The house was hot. Of course it was. And that just stoked my irritability. Flinging myself onto my bed, I stared at the pictures on the wall of my wrinkle-free younger self with my best friends from the neighborhood. I felt like I was regressing. Shortly after arriving, I had started acting like a paranoid teenager.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?